The flight was smooth, the first-class cabin quiet, until one moment changed everything. An elderly man politely asked the flight attendant for a simple glass of water for his wife. Her response? A cold refusal, her tone sharp, dismissive, like they didn't belong. Other passengers noticed, whispers spread, but no one spoke up. The flight attendant carried on, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. Because the couple she had just humiliated, they weren't ordinary passengers. They owned the airline, and by the time the plane landed, she wouldn't just be serving drinks. She'd be facing a decision that would end her career forever. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new one. The plane was already boarding, and passengers were settling into their seats. Among them, an elderly couple, Edric and Leora Whitmore, walked slowly down the aisle, their hands intertwined as they searched for their seats in the first-class cabin. Edric, dressed in a neatly pressed navy suit, walked with quiet confidence, while Leora, wearing an elegant yet simple cream-colored dress, moved with grace. They weren't in a hurry, nor did they seem out of place, but the way a few passengers glanced at them, as if questioning whether they belonged, didn't go unnoticed. The couple, however, remained composed, unfazed by the silent judgment around them. They reached their seats, 2A and 2B, and carefully placed their small carry-on bags in the overhead compartment. Leora sat down first, sighing softly as she leaned back, her fingers brushing over the armrest. She was tired, and the long hours of travel had left her feeling drained. Edric settled beside her, glancing around before pressing the call button for the flight attendant. He didn't expect trouble. All he wanted was a simple request: water for Leora, who had been feeling slightly dehydrated since their last layover. A few moments later, Mira Rowan, a senior flight attendant, appeared. Her uniform was crisp and her posture was straight, but her eyes held something else, a quiet air of superiority. Mira had worked in first class for years, and in her mind she knew exactly the kind of passengers who typically occupied these seats. Without looking at the couple's tickets, without even considering why they might be sitting there, she had already made a silent judgment. She crossed her arms, waiting. Edric smiled politely, gesturing toward Leora. "Could we have a glass of water, please? She isn't feeling too well." Mira's lips tightened slightly, her posture stiff. "Water will be served with the meal service," she replied curtly, barely looking at them. Her tone wasn't outright rude, but it carried something unspoken, dismissiveness, as if their request was an inconvenience. Edric tilted his head slightly, his face remaining calm. "I understand, but she just needs a small sip. If you could bring a glass now, it would be very kind of you." Mira let out a quiet sigh, as if she had more important matters to handle. "Sir, we have a schedule for a reason. If I bring water to one passenger early, then others will start asking for the same. I'm sure you can wait like everyone else." A few passengers nearby stole glances at the exchange, but no one spoke up. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others quickly turned away, pretending they weren't listening. Sienna Hale, a junior flight attendant, stood near the galley, watching the scene unfold. She hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. But she said nothing. She was new to this position and had learned quickly that questioning Mira Rowan was not a good idea. Leora, sitting beside Edric, touched his hand gently, silently telling him to let it go. She wasn't the type to argue over small matters. But Edric, though patient, didn't believe in allowing people to be treated unfairly. His face remained unreadable as he withdrew his hand from the call button, nodding as if he had accepted Mira's decision. Mira, satisfied that she had ended the conversation, turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Edric leaned back into his seat, his expression giving away nothing. But he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone. Without urgency, without making a scene, he typed a simple message and sent it. Then he set the phone down on the tray table, clasping his hands together as he gazed out the window. Leora glanced at him, her voice soft. "Are you sure you want to handle it this way?" Edric smiled faintly, his voice just as quiet. She'll learn soon enough. The moment had already passed, but something lingered in the air, something Mira Rowan had failed to notice. This wasn't over, not even close. Mira Rowan moved briskly through the first-class cabin, straightening trays and offering drinks to the other passengers, her earlier exchange with the elderly couple already fading from her mind. In her years of working flights, she had learned how to shut down unnecessary requests quickly. First-class service was about luxury, yes, but it was also about maintaining order. If she started bending the rules for one passenger, she'd be running back and forth the entire flight, and she had no patience for that. At the front of the plane near the galley, Sienna Hale watched Mira with uneasy eyes. She was still new to first class, but something about how Mira handled the situation didn't sit right with her. Water was such a simple request. Would it really have hurt to give them a glass? She hesitated before speaking. "Mira," she said quietly so other passengers wouldn't hear. "Are you sure about that?" The lady looked really exhausted. Mira shot her a sharp look, her irritation evident. "Sienna, let me give you some advice. If you want to last in first class, you need to stop second-guessing how things are done. They can wait like everyone else." Sienna bit her lip, nodding reluctantly, but the uncomfortable feeling didn't leave her. She had seen Mira act this way before, dismissing passengers she deemed unimportant. Usually it was quiet, subtle, in ways that no one would complain about, but this time, something felt different. Meanwhile, Edric Whitmore sat back in his seat, watching the way Mira moved from passenger to passenger, smiling warmly at some while barely acknowledging others. Leora had closed her eyes, trying to rest, but Edric could see the slight furrow in her brow. She wasn't upset, but he knew her well enough to recognize when something had unsettled her. His phone vibrated softly on the tray table. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. Message received. Understood. A faint smile crossed his lips. He turned off the screen and placed the phone back down. There was no need for urgency. The plane was already in the air. The situation would resolve itself soon enough. Mira continued her rounds, stopping by a well-dressed businessman in seat 1C, offering him a drink with a bright, professional smile. "Would you like champagne or a cocktail to start?" she asked smoothly. The man barely looked up from his tablet as he replied, "Just water, please." Without hesitation, Mira nodded. "Of course, sir," she said, pouring a glass from the chilled bottle behind her and setting it gently on his tray. She even added a napkin, ensuring the presentation was perfect. Edric watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, didn't even turn to look at Mira, but the message was clear. The moment she had refused him and Leora something as simple as water, claiming it was against protocol, she had unknowingly exposed herself. She wasn't refusing everyone, only them. Leora stirred beside him, opening her eyes slowly. She had heard the businessman's request, heard the smooth way Mira had complied. She didn't react, simply rested a hand on Edric's arm, feeling the quiet strength in him. Sienna, standing a few feet away, had also noticed. Her stomach twisted slightly as she watched Mira move through the cabin with effortless charm, catering to certain passengers while others were barely acknowledged. Before she could stop herself, she took a small step forward and whispered, "Mira, I thought you said water would only be served with the meal." Mira barely spared her a glance. "That's different," she said under her breath. "He's a regular in first class." Sienna's breath caught in her throat. The way Mira said it so casually, as if it was an unspoken rule everyone should understand, made something inside her tighten. She wanted to say more, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Mira was senior staff, and questioning her too much could put Sienna's own job at risk. Across the cabin, Edric calmly picked up his phone again. He typed another brief message before setting it down once more. "Make sure the captain is informed. No confrontation. Let her finish her work." Leora exhaled softly, her voice quiet enough that only Edric could hear. "She still doesn't know, does she?" Edric's lips curved slightly. "Not yet." The plane continued soaring through the sky, steady and uninterrupted. But inside the cabin, something had already started shifting, and Mira Rowan had no idea that her time in control was running out. Mira moved through the first-class cabin with confidence, unaware of the quiet storm brewing around her. She had done this job for years, and in her mind, she knew exactly how things worked. Some passengers were worth extra attention, those who flew frequently, those who looked like they belonged. Others, well, they were just filling seats. She didn't look twice at Edric and Leora Whitmore as she continued her routine. In her mind, they had been handled. They weren't troublemakers, just an elderly couple who had probably saved up for this one flight. She had no intention of giving them another second of her time. Edric sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look irritated or impatient. In fact, he looked perfectly at ease. But inside, he was measuring every moment, every choice Mira was making. Leora remained quiet beside him, but he knew she was paying attention as well. A soft ping sounded over the intercom, and a deep, steady voice came through. "Ms. Rowan, please report to the cockpit." Mira frowned slightly, but she didn't hesitate. She straightened her uniform and walked briskly to the front of the plane, disappearing behind the cockpit door. Sienna, who had been watching everything unfold, swallowed hard. Something was happening. Inside the cockpit, Captain Roland Vance turned to face Mira as she stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain weight in his eyes. On the screen in front of him, the in-flight phone was connected to an executive call. Mira's stomach twisted slightly. She had never been called in here mid-flight before. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "Ms. Rowan, we received a priority communication regarding your service in first class. We need you to clarify a situation." Mira stiffened. "Of course, sir. What's the issue?" There was a pause. Then the voice continued. "An elderly couple in seats 2A and 2B requested water before the meal service. You denied them." Mira's heartbeat quickened. "Yes, but you later served water to another passenger without issue." The cockpit felt smaller now, the air heavier. Mira straightened, trying to keep her voice composed. "Well, he's a frequent first-class flyer. I was following standard service practices." Captain Vance gave her a long, unreadable look before pressing a button to unmute the call. "Ms. Rowan, do you know who the couple in 2A and 2B are?" Mira blinked, confused by the question. "No, I don't," the voice on the other end of the call answered before she could finish. "Edric and Leora Whitmore. They own the airline." Mira felt the floor drop from beneath her. Her mouth went dry. Her mind raced back to the way she had spoken to them, the way she had dismissed them without a second thought. She had refused service to the very people who had built the airline she worked for. The voice on the call continued, no longer neutral, but ice cold. "You will return to them immediately. You will correct your mistake, and when we land, you will be required to explain your actions to the executive board. Do you understand?" Mira swallowed, her throat dry. Yes, sir." Captain Vance exhaled sharply and turned back to his controls. "Then you'd better get back to work." Mira turned and walked out of the cockpit, her legs suddenly feeling much heavier. The weight of what she had done was finally sinking in, and she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Mira stepped out of the cockpit, her breath coming faster than usual. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, but for the first time she barely heard it. Her mind raced, replaying every word from the executive call. She had humiliated the owners of the airline. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She couldn't let the passengers see that something was wrong. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform, regaining her composure. Sienna stood near the galley, watching as Mira walked past her. She caught the brief flicker of unease in Mira's face, something she had never seen before. Mira Rowan was always in control, always confident. But now she looked like she had just seen a ghost. Mira stopped a few steps away from Edric and Leora's seats. For the first time, she truly looked at them. Edric sat comfortably, his posture relaxed. yet his presence commanded attention. Leora remained poised, her fingers lightly resting on her lap. They weren't angry. They weren't demanding anything. They were just waiting. Mira cleared her throat and crouched slightly so she was at their eye level. Her voice was softer now, but it still carried that forced professionalism. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her words measured. "There was a misunderstanding earlier. I'd like to offer you some refreshments." Edric turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. His voice was quiet, steady, but there was something in it that made Mira's skin prickle. She nodded quickly, forcing a tight smile. "Yes, She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize we were important?" Edric asked, his expression unreadable. Mira's face burned. "No, sir, that's not what I meant. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket." Leora spoke for the first time, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You didn't hesitate to serve other passengers, just us." Mira felt the weight of their words settle in her chest. A few passengers nearby had turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen but very clearly paying attention. Edric leaned forward just a bit. "Tell me, Ms. Rowan, why did you assume we didn't belong here?" Mira opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was no way to spin it, no excuse that wouldn't sound hollow. She had made a mistake, a terrible one. She swallowed hard. I misjudged the situation," she said finally. Edric studied her for a long moment. Then, he leaned back in his seat. "If you're going to apologize, Ms. Rowan, I suggest you do it properly." Mira's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years controlling situations like this, making the rules, keeping things in order. But now she wasn't in control at all. She took a shaky breath. "I sincerely apologize," she said quietly. "I was wrong." Leora gave a small nod but said nothing. Edric didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Mira stood there for a moment longer. Then, feeling exposed under the weight of their silence, she quickly turned and walked back toward the galley. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight. Her authority gone. She had never felt this small before. And for the first time she realized this was only the beginning. Mira moved quickly toward the galley, her heart pounding in a way it never had before. The weight of Edric's stare, the quiet authority in Leora's voice, it was unlike anything she had ever encountered. This wasn't a passenger who would raise their voice, demand compensation, or threaten a complaint. No, this was worse. Edric Whitmore had the power to end her career with a single decision, and she had just delivered that decision to his hands. Sienna was still standing near the service station when Mira passed her. "Are you okay?" she asked cautiously, noting the color draining from Mira's face. Mira ignored her, reaching for a tray, hands unsteady as she arranged glasses, pretending to focus. But Sienna wasn't convinced. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she added quietly. Mira finally exhaled, closing her eyes for a second before muttering under her breath, "I think I just ruined my entire career." Sienna frowned, glancing toward the first-class cabin where Edric and Leora still sat, calm and composed. "What do you mean?" Mira hesitated. She wasn't about to admit what had happened in the cockpit, but she could feel Sienna's gaze pressing her for an answer. Before Mira could say anything, the in-flight phone buzzed sharply. She flinched. Sienna reached for it before Mira could stop her, lifting the receiver. "First-class galley," she said professionally. Then she paused, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Yes, she's here." She held out the phone to Mira. "It's for you." Mira's stomach twisted as she took the receiver. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "This is Mira Rowan." The voice on the other end was clipped and direct. "Ms. Rowan, the executive team has been briefed. You are to report to the boardroom immediately after landing. Mr. Whitmore has requested a full review of this incident. There will be a disciplinary hearing." Mira felt like the air had been knocked out of her chest. "I acknowledged," the voice interrupted. Mira swallowed hard. "Yes, acknowledged." The call cut off. Her grip tightened around the receiver before she slowly set it back in place. Sienna had been watching closely. What was that about? Mira turned to her sharply. Nothing. Just focus on the service. But she knew. She had spent years climbing her way up in this airline. Years enforcing rules, taking charge, believing she was untouchable. And now, in a matter of hours, it was all slipping through her fingers. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stand straighter, to keep moving, to pretend like she still had control. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had lost control the moment she chose the wrong passengers to dismiss. And there was no undoing it now. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a tray of drinks, forcing herself to keep moving. She needed to appear normal, to act as though nothing was wrong, but the weight in her chest was growing heavier with each passing second. She had handled difficult passengers before, had diffused tense situations, had even received complaints in the past. But this was different. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about who she had chosen to dismiss. She walked back into the first-class cabin, careful to keep her expression neutral. Edric Whitmore was still seated comfortably, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. He looked entirely at ease, as though he had already forgotten the earlier exchange. But Mira knew better. Leora sat beside him, flipping through the in-flight magazine, the picture of quiet elegance. Mira avoided making eye contact with them as she moved past, stopping at row 3 where another passenger had signaled for a drink. She smiled politely, forcing her voice into its usual pleasant tone. "Can I get you anything?" The man requested a coffee, and she nodded quickly, relieved to have something to do. She turned back toward the galley, her mind racing. Passengers were beginning to take notice. Not all of them had seen the earlier exchange, but whispers had started spreading. A woman across the aisle had leaned toward her husband, murmuring under her breath. A man a few rows back kept glancing between Mira and the Whitmores, as if putting the pieces together. Even if she wanted to pretend nothing had happened, it was clear now. The entire first-class cabin knew something was off. Sienna stood near the galley entrance, watching as Mira returned to prepare the coffee. She hesitated before speaking, keeping her voice low. "I know you don't want to talk, but I think you should be prepared." Mira stiffened. "For what?" Sienna bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "You embarrassed them, and now people are realizing it. They're whispering, watching. You might think this is just between you and them, but passengers are paying attention." Mira's chest tightened. She wanted to snap at Sienna, to tell her to mind her own business, but deep down she knew the younger flight attendant was right. She had controlled the situation earlier, or at least she thought she had. Now she had no control over what people were thinking, over what they were telling themselves, over the way they were beginning to look at her differently. She grabbed the coffee pot, swallowing down the growing anxiety in her throat. She still had a few hours left on this flight, and somehow she had to survive them. Mira carried the coffee pot back to row 3, pouring the drink carefully, keeping her movements steady. She forced a small, polite smile as she placed the cup down, pretending like everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. As she turned to walk back toward the galley, she felt the weight of several eyes following her. She had spent years working in first class, always carrying herself with confidence, always believing she had authority. Now, that authority felt like it was slipping away with every step she took. She glanced toward Edric and Leora again. They weren't looking at her. Edric was scrolling through his phone, occasionally tapping out a message. Leora, calm as ever, was sipping from a glass of sparkling water, one she had received from another flight attendant after Mira's earlier refusal. The realization stung. Someone else had served them. Someone else had done the job she should have done. Mira took a deep breath, steeling herself before returning to the galley. But just as she passed row 1, a passenger, a middle-aged woman in a tailored blazer, spoke up. "Excuse me." Mira turned, her practiced smile returning. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" The woman's expression was polite, but her tone held something else, something knowing. "I was just wondering, When exactly did the rules change about when water can be served? Mira's stomach flipped. She kept her smile in place. I'm sorry. The woman gestured subtly toward Edric and Leora. Because I heard what you told them earlier, and then I saw you serve water to another passenger 5 minutes later. She tilted her head slightly. Just curious what the policy is, since it seems to change depending on who's asking. Mira's grip on her tray tightened. Her throat felt dry. She wasn't just being questioned. She was being called out. Other passengers had turned their heads now, subtly but deliberately, pretending to adjust their seats or look at their watches while listening intently. Mira's heart pounded. She had two choices. She could try to defend herself, to spin some kind of excuse, or she could keep her response short and neutral, hoping the woman would drop it. She forced another smile. I apologize if there was any confusion, ma'am. That wasn't my intention. The woman raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. Mira felt the tension pressing down on her. Every second felt heavier, the stares sharper. She needed to get out of this moment before it spiraled further. Would you like anything to drink? She asked quickly, hoping to shift the conversation. The woman let the silence stretch just a little too long before finally giving a slow nod. Just water. Mira clenched her jaw but nodded. Of course. She hurried back toward the galley, her pulse hammering in her ears. Sienna was already there, watching everything unfold. So, she said carefully, keeping her voice low. That went well. Mira shot her a sharp look. Drop it. Sienna raised her hands in surrender, but there was something in her eyes. A look that said she knew exactly what was happening, and she wasn't the only one. Mira grabbed a bottle of water and a glass, preparing the drink. But her hands weren't as steady as before. The weight of her mistake was growing heavier by the minute, and no matter how much she wanted to act like she was still in control, the reality was becoming clearer. She wasn't just losing the respect of the Whitmores. She was losing control of the entire cabin. And once that happened, there would be no getting it back. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she set the water glass on the tray, taking a deep breath before stepping back into the cabin. She knew she needed to compose herself, but the air in first class felt different now, charged, like an unspoken tension had settled between the rows. She carried the tray carefully to row 1, placing the glass of water in front of the woman who had questioned her. She expected the woman to say something, maybe push the issue further, but instead she simply took the glass, gave Mira a knowing look, and returned to reading her book. Mira turned quickly, eager to get away, but as she passed Edric and Leora's seats, she heard a soft voice. Ms. Rowan. She froze. Leora had spoken, her voice gentle yet firm. Mira turned slowly, her stomach twisting. She didn't want to meet the woman's eyes, but she had no choice. Leora set her magazine aside, looking up at her with the same quiet grace she had maintained throughout the entire flight. How much longer until we land? Mira hesitated, caught off guard by the question. A little under 2 hours, ma'am. Leora nodded, as if considering something. Then she smiled, polite, soft, but unmistakably deliberate. That's plenty of time. Mira didn't know why, but those words sent a chill through her. Edric, who had been silent, finally spoke without looking up from his phone. Ms. Rowan, do you believe in accountability? Mira's breath caught slightly. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The way he asked the question, it wasn't an accusation, nor was it said with anger. It was simply a test. She swallowed hard. Of course, sir. Edric finally lifted his gaze to her, and for the first time she saw it, the weight of his presence, the kind of authority that needed no raised voice, no threats. He was a man who had built something, who had spent decades understanding power, influence, and most of all, the way people revealed themselves through their choices. Good, he said simply. Then he returned his attention to his phone, dismissing her with nothing more than silence. Mira stood there for a moment longer, unsure if she should say something, if she should try to salvage what was left. But what could she say? What excuse could possibly make this better? She turned quickly and walked back toward the galley, feeling a prickling heat spread across her skin. She had made plenty of mistakes in her career, had dealt with difficult passengers before, had even received complaints that never amounted to anything. But this was something different. This wasn't a complaint that would be buried under paperwork. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away. She had treated Edric and Leora Whitmore unfairly, not because of policy, not because of airline rules, but because of a decision she had made, one that was now unraveling her authority in front of an entire cabin of people. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if there was anything she could do to stop it. The in-flight phone rang again. Sienna picked it up this time, her expression tightening as she listened to the voice on the other end. Then she glanced at Mira, hesitating before holding out the receiver. "It's for you," she said, her voice unreadable. Mira's stomach turned. She knew who it would be before she even lifted the phone to her ear. "This is Mira Rowan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The response was immediate. "This is Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations." Mira squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second. She had never spoken to Dominic Carter directly before. He was 2 levels above her in the airline's hierarchy. Someone who handled serious matters, not minor infractions. He continued without waiting for her response. "Upon landing, you will report directly to the executive boardroom. There will be a formal review of your conduct on this flight, do you understand?" Mira's throat went dry. "Yes, sir." There was a brief silence. Then, his voice dropped slightly, carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. "You should know something, Ms. Rowan. Mr. Whitmore isn't the type to demand punishments." Mira felt a small flicker of hope, but it was crushed by his next words. "He's the type to change policies." Mira's breath hitched. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the way she had handled this flight becoming a turning point in airline policy. Dominic Carter continued, "Do not approach the Whitmores again. Your interaction with them is over. The executive team will handle the rest." The call disconnected. Mira lowered the phone slowly, her hands ice cold. Sienna was still watching her. She had heard enough to understand. "Are you—" Sienna started, but Mira didn't let her finish. "I don't want to talk," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. For years, she had carried herself with control, had believed she was the one with the authority. Now she wasn't even allowed to speak to the passengers she had wronged. And for the first time in her career, Mira Rowan realized she was completely powerless. Mira stared at the in-flight phone, its silent presence mocking her. Her mind was spinning, but the reality of the situation was settling in quickly. There was no escaping this, no smoothing things over, no filing a simple report and moving on. She had lost control of the flight, of her authority, and now she was losing control of her own future. Sienna was still watching her from across the galley, her arms crossed, expression cautious. She wanted to say something, that much was obvious, but she knew better than to push Mira when she was in this state. Mira's breath came in slow, shaky exhales. She needed to regain composure. She needed to act like none of this was happening, like she wasn't moments away from a career-ending disciplinary hearing. With rigid movements, she reached for a tray of meal service items, pretending to focus on arranging them, as if she could make herself disappear by keeping busy. Sienna sighed quietly, stepping forward. "You do realize what's happening, don't you?" Mira clenched her jaw. "Not now, Sienna." "No, I think now is the perfect time," Sienna said, her voice careful but firm. "Because you keep acting like this is just a bad passenger interaction, like it's going to go away when we land." Mira's hands tightened around the tray. Sienna exhaled, lowering her voice. "You didn't just insult any first-class passenger, Mira. You dismissed Edric and Leora Whitmore, the people who own the airline." Mira flinched at the words. She knew them already, but hearing them said out loud made the weight even heavier. Sienna shook her head. "Do you know what that means?" she pressed. "It means that whatever happens when we land isn't just about you. It's about what changes because of you." Mira's stomach churned, but she didn't answer. Sienna took another step forward. "I've seen you ignore passengers before. I've seen you make those little choices, the ones where you decide who gets special treatment and who doesn't." She paused, looking at Mira directly. "But this time, you made the wrong choice, and now everyone is watching." Mira's eyes snapped to hers, the tension between them thick and unspoken. Sienna was right. Mira had always been careful, always subtle. But this time she had chosen the wrong people to dismiss, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Passengers in first class were whispering. She could feel their stares, the shift in energy. They had seen what happened. They had noticed the inconsistency, the unfairness. And now, even if none of them spoke up directly, they would remember. And if they remembered, they would talk. She had seen it happen before. One viral social media post, one passenger recounting the story to the right person. And suddenly, a minor incident turned into a company-wide scandal. Her chest tightened. She needed to think. She needed a way out of this. Mira pressed her fingers against her temple, inhaling deeply. "I can fix this," she muttered, half to herself. No," Sienna cut in, shaking her head. "You can't." Mira blinked, stunned at the finality in her voice. Sienna's expression was unreadable, but there was something like disappointment in her eyes. "There's nothing you can say to make this better. The decision isn't yours anymore." Mira's breath hitched slightly. She had spent years being the one making decisions, the one controlling how things played out. But now she was just waiting for a verdict. And for someone like Mira, that was the worst punishment of all. The thought made her stomach turn, but before she could respond, another voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for initial descent." The words sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over Mira. She had never wanted a flight to last longer, because once they landed, she would no longer be the one in charge. She would be the one being judged. Mira swallowed hard as the captain's voice faded from the intercom. The weight in her chest grew heavier. Initial descent meant there were less than 30 minutes left before landing. Less than 30 minutes before she would have to step off this plane, walk through the airport, and enter a boardroom filled with executives who were already waiting for her. She had spent years in control of first-class service, setting the rules, deciding who deserved extra attention and who didn't. But now, she was the one who would be evaluated. Every choice she had made on this flight would be picked apart, examined, and used to determine whether she would have a future with this airline at all. Her stomach twisted. Sienna was still standing in the galley, watching her, but this time, she didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Mira exhaled sharply, forcing herself to straighten up. She had two choices. Either she could let this break her, or she could act like she was still in control. She turned to the meal service trays, adjusting them, pretending to be busy. If she focused on the small tasks, maybe she could quiet the storm raging inside her. But as she stepped out into the first-class cabin, she realized something. Passengers weren't just glancing at her anymore. They were watching her. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The businessman in row 1 barely looked up from his tablet, but she caught the way his fingers hesitated before tapping the screen. The woman who had questioned her earlier in the flight now had her arms crossed, her eyes flicking toward Edric and Leora every so often, as if waiting for something. Even the flight attendants moving through the aisle seemed to be stepping around her more cautiously, as if distancing themselves from whatever consequences were coming. Mira's pulse quickened. She wasn't invisible anymore. For years, she had been able to move through flights with authority, making quiet decisions, choosing which passengers mattered and which ones didn't. Now she was the subject of quiet judgment. It was an unfamiliar feeling, uncomfortable, exposing. She reached the front of the cabin, where Leora sat with her hands gently folded in her lap, still the perfect picture of calm. Edric was typing something on his phone, his expression unreadable. Mira's mouth went dry. The Whitmores had barely acknowledged her since her forced apology, and somehow that was worse than if they had been openly furious. She considered saying something, anything, but she knew better. The moment had passed. Her fate was no longer in her hands. Instead, she turned stiffly, preparing to walk back to the galley. Then, the in-flight phone buzzed again. The sound made her flinch. For the first time, she hesitated before answering. She didn't want to hear what was coming next, but ignoring it wasn't an option. With forced composure, she picked up the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "This is Mira Rowan." A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. "Ms. Rowan, this is James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations." Mira's breath hitched. James Caldwell. She had never spoken to him directly, only seen his name in corporate emails and announcements. If he was involved, then this wasn't just an internal review. This was an executive-level disciplinary matter. Her fingers gripped the receiver tighter. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. There was a pause. Then his voice came through, even and steady. "Upon landing, you are to remain on board until you are escorted by security to the executive office. You will not be dismissed with the rest of the cabin crew." Mira's stomach dropped. "Security?" she repeated weakly. "Yes, you are being placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation." The words struck her like a punch to the gut. She had expected a formal hearing, maybe a written reprimand, but suspension. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. James Caldwell continued, his voice holding no room for argument. "A statement has already been filed. Mr. Whitmore has personally requested that this matter be reviewed at the highest level." Mira's heart pounded. This was worse than she thought. Edric Whitmore wasn't demanding her termination. He wasn't making a scene. He was doing something far more powerful. He was making sure that her actions were documented, placed under scrutiny, and used as a case study for change. She could already see the headlines forming in her mind. Stories about biased treatment in first class, about airline employees making silent judgments, about policies being rewritten because of one decision made at 30,000 feet. Her head was spinning. Caldwell's voice cut through the fog in her mind. "Do you understand these instructions, Ms. Rowan?" Mira swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. "Yes, sir." "Good. We land in 20 minutes." The call ended with a sharp click. Mira lowered the phone slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. She turned her head slightly, and for the first time, her eyes met Edric Whitmore's. He hadn't looked at her once since their earlier exchange, but now, as the final moments of the flight ticked away, he lifted his gaze and held hers. There was no anger in his expression, no gloating, just quiet, measured authority. And that made it worse, because it meant he had already won. Mira turned sharply, walking toward the galley, her movement stiff and mechanical. She had 20 minutes left in the air, 20 minutes before she stepped off this plane and into whatever fate was waiting for her. And for the first time in her entire career, she was terrified. The final descent began, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers adjusted their seats, preparing for landing. Mira stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cold press of reality settled in her chest, heavier than it had ever felt before. This wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't just another complaint to be handled in a standard review meeting. This was a reckoning. She inhaled sharply, willing her hands to stop shaking. She needed to keep it together, at least until they landed. No one could see her like this, weak, unraveling. She had always been the one in control, the one deciding the rules. But now she was nothing more than a symbol of everything wrong with the system. The airline executives weren't just looking at her as an employee who had made a mistake. They were looking at her as the example, the case study, the warning. And Edric Whitmore. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded an apology. He had done something far worse. He had set something in motion. Mira turned her head slightly, peering out into the first-class cabin. She could still feel the shift in the air, the way passengers were whispering, side-eyeing her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some of them would forget this incident by the time they reached their final destination. But others would talk. They would tell their families, their friends, maybe even post about it online. And once a story like this spread, it would no longer be just about Mira Rowan. It would be about every other moment like this. Every unspoken rule, every biased decision made in silence, every time someone had been dismissed for not looking like they belonged. Her pulse quickened at the thought. Sienna was still watching her from across the galley, but this time she didn't say anything. There was no need. The look in her eyes was enough. Mira turned away sharply, unable to face that knowing expression. The final announcement came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your tray tables are up, and all carry-on items are securely stowed." Passengers shifted in their seats, adjusting themselves, preparing for the familiar jolt of wheels hitting the tarmac. For most of them, this was just another flight. For Mira, it was the last few minutes of her career as she knew it. Her breath came out slow, uneven. And then, it happened. The plane touched down, a smooth landing, the usual soft gasps of passengers adjusting after the descent, the tension of travel releasing from their bodies. For everyone else, this meant the journey was over. For Mira, it was just beginning. She remained frozen in place, her stomach twisting with each second that passed. She could hear the seatbelt signs ding off, the soft rustling of passengers reaching for their bags, the quiet murmurs of conversation filling the air again. She could almost pretend that this was just a normal landing, until she saw them, the security officers. They were waiting at the front of the aircraft just beyond the door. Two of them, standing stiffly in their uniforms, their eyes fixed on the entrance as if they were waiting for someone. Waiting for her. Mira's body went cold. This wasn't just a suspension. This was an escort. The realization struck hard. She wasn't going to walk off this plane like every other flight attendant, head held high, moving on to her next duty shift. No, she was being removed. Publicly. The murmurs in first class had quieted as well. Passengers noticed. Some of them already understood what was happening, and the few who didn't would figure it out soon enough. Mira clenched her jaw, trying to keep her expression blank, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She wasn't used to this. She was used to being the one in control. But now, she was the one being watched. She turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on Edric and Leora Whitmore. They had not moved. They were still seated, still composed, as if they had known all along how this flight was going to end for her. Edric looked at his watch, not out of impatience, not out of arrogance, just a quiet confirmation that things were moving as they should. Leora's eyes met Mira's. For a second there was no tension, no hostility, just understanding. And that was somehow worse. Mira wanted them to be angry, to be demanding, to be loud. She wanted something that she could fight back against, something she could explain away. But this was justice moving forward without her. Mira sucked in a breath, bracing herself. She had no choice now. The doors of the aircraft opened. Passengers in first class slowly stood, some of them sneaking glances at her, others pretending not to notice, though their curiosity was clear. Mira remained in place. She knew what was coming. One of the security officers stepped forward, stopping just beside her. His voice was calm, professional. "Ms. Rowan, please come with us." The final confirmation. This wasn't a request. Mira's chest tightened, but she nodded stiffly. Without a word, she stepped forward, walking past rows of passengers who had once seen her as someone with authority. Now, they saw her as someone who had lost everything. She walked down the aisle, her steps forced and rigid. No one stopped her. No one spoke up for her. And as she stepped off the aircraft, leaving the first-class cabin behind, she realized something. It had never been about the water. It had never been about a single mistake. It had always been about the choice she made, and the people she made it against. And now, she would have to live with that choice forever. Mira stepped into the jet bridge, the cold artificial air hitting her like a slap. The distant hum of the airport buzzed through the walls, but inside, it was silent. Uncomfortably so. The security officers flanked her on either side, walking in sync with her stiff, measured steps. She had always walked through airports with confidence, wearing her uniform like a badge of authority. But now she felt like a prisoner being marched to sentencing. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, a way to spin the story, to downplay what had happened, to salvage what was left of her career. Maybe if she presented it as a misunderstanding, maybe if she showed that she had been following protocol. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't about protocol. This wasn't about whether she had followed airline policy. This was about how she had used her authority. And now, the people who had given her that authority were taking it away. The doors at the end of the jet bridge slid open, revealing the terminal. Mira's breath hitched when she saw them. 2 airline executives waiting just beyond security clearance. One of them, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a sharp suit, James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations, stood with his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't need to say anything for Mira to understand. This was no longer just an internal review. Next to him stood Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations. His expression was unreadable, but Mira could already tell. He wasn't here to listen to excuses. Passengers from the flight had begun filtering into the terminal behind her, some of them catching sight of the scene unfolding in front of them. She saw a few murmuring to each other. Some had already pulled out their phones. Mira felt a prickle of panic. Were they recording? She could already see the headlines, the social media posts, the speculation. First-class flight attendant escorted off plane by security after dispute with airline owners. The thought made her feel sick. James Caldwell turned, his gaze landing on Mira, cool and assessing. "Ms. Rowan," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Follow us." The security officer stepped aside, and Mira hesitated for just a second before forcing her legs to move. She kept her shoulders straight, her face neutral, but inside, her mind was spiraling. She followed Caldwell and Carter through a set of private airport corridors, away from the public eye. The walls were stark white, the overhead lights too bright. Each step echoed, a steady drumbeat counting down to whatever fate was waiting for her at the end of this hallway. After a few minutes, they stopped in front of a frosted glass door with a metal plaque, Executive Review Room. Caldwell swiped his badge and pushed the door open. Inside, a long, sleek conference table stretched across the room. 3 other executives were already seated, their faces unreadable. And at the head of the table sat Edric Whitmore. Mira's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she imagined. This wasn't just a disciplinary review. This was personal. The weight of what she had done settled fully onto her shoulders. She had assumed Edric Whitmore and his wife didn't belong. And now? She was standing in his space, on his terms. Caldwell gestured to a seat across from Edric. "Sit." Mira hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, to escape the crushing weight of judgment pressing down on her. But there was nowhere left to run. She pulled out the chair and sat. Edric Whitmore sat back in his chair, calm, composed, unreadable. He studied her for a long moment, his fingers steepled together. Then finally, he spoke. "Ms. Rowan," he said, his voice even. "Do you know why you're here?" Mira's throat tightened. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "Good." Another pause. Then Edric leaned forward slightly. "Now tell me," he said, his voice steady, carrying the full weight of who he was. "Why did you think we didn't belong?" Mira's heart pounded so loudly, she thought it might shake the walls, because there was no right answer to that question, and there never had been. Mira's throat felt dry, her palms clammy against the smooth surface of the conference table. The air in the room felt heavier than it should have, the silence stretching between her and Edric Whitmore like an unbearable weight pressing down on her chest. She had faced difficult conversations before, angry passengers, impatient executives, tense discussions with crew members. But never had she sat across from a man who could single-handedly determine her entire future with just a few words. Edric's gaze was unwavering, patient, yet unrelenting. "Why did you think we didn't belong?" The question echoed in her head, bouncing off every excuse, every justification she had rehearsed before stepping into this room. But none of them fit, because there was no reasonable explanation, none that wouldn't make her look worse than she already did. Mira swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hem of her uniform skirt. She glanced around the room, searching for anything, anyone, who might ease the unbearable tension sitting on her shoulders. James Caldwell and Dominic Carter sat on either side of Edric, both waiting, their faces unreadable. The three other executives, whose names she barely knew, observed her in silence. But the worst part? Leora Whitmore was there too. She sat a few seats down, elegant as ever, her fingers lightly resting against a white ceramic cup of tea, which someone had placed in front of her. Unlike Edric, she wasn't looking at Mira with scrutiny. No, her expression was something far worse. Disappointment. Mira forced herself to answer. I didn't mean... Edric lifted a hand slightly, stopping her before she could dig a deeper hole. "Let's be clear, Ms. Rowan," he said, his voice level. "I'm not asking for corporate buzzwords or a carefully rehearsed explanation." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm asking for the truth." Mira's heart pounded. She had been trained to navigate difficult conversations, to de-escalate situations, to redirect blame without making it obvious. But none of those tactics would work here, not when she was already exposed. Her mouth opened, then closed. She didn't have an answer, or rather, she didn't have one that wouldn't make her look like the exact type of person the airline would want to remove. Edric leaned back slightly, observing her hesitation. "You were comfortable denying us service, Ms. Rowan. You were confident when you made that choice. Where's that confidence now?" Mira's stomach churned. She glanced at James Caldwell, hoping he might intervene, but he only adjusted his watch, making it clear this wasn't his fight to step into. She was on her own. She inhaled shakily. I didn't intentionally try to treat you unfairly," she finally said, choosing her words with care. "I made a misjudgment." Leora stirred her tea slowly with a small spoon, her gaze finally lifting to meet Mira's. "A misjudgment," she repeated, voice smooth as silk. "Interesting." The way she said it sent a chill down Mira's spine. Edric folded his hands together on the table. "Let's test that theory," he said. "Let's say that was truly just a misjudgment." He gave a small nod. "Then tell me, Ms. Rowan, how often do you misjudge first-class passengers? How often do you refuse simple requests from those who don't look the part?" Mira froze. That was it. That was the trap. If she denied it, she would sound defensive, like she was trying to erase her past behavior. If she admitted it, she would be confirming exactly what Edric already knew. Either way, she had already lost. She gripped the edge of her seat, her breathing uneven. Leora set her teaspoon down with a quiet clink against the saucer. "I think we both know the answer," she said softly. Mira's chest tightened. She had spent years moving through first class, deciding who got the extra care, who got the effortless smiles, who got priority service without question, and who didn't. She had done it so often, so seamlessly, that she had never once stopped to think about what it meant. Not until now. Edric exhaled, but it wasn't a sigh of exhaustion or irritation. It was a calculated pause, one that let the silence press in around her. Then, he looked at James Caldwell. "Is this the kind of leadership you want running first class?" Mira's stomach dropped. James, who had been silent until now, adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. He didn't look at her when he answered. "No, sir." The finality in those two words sent a bolt of panic through her chest. She was losing this. She was losing everything. Mira straightened slightly, her voice shaking as she forced out, "I understand that I made a mistake, but You didn't make a mistake," Edric interrupted, his voice like steel. "A mistake is forgetting to bring someone their coffee or mixing up meal orders." He leaned in slightly. "What you did was a choice." The words sliced through her. A choice. She felt her breath hitch, her composure slipping further with every second that passed. Leora's voice cut through the tension, soft but firm. "What you did to us today, Ms. Rowan. We have experienced that kind of treatment before." She tilted her head slightly. "But I wonder, if we hadn't been the owners of the airline, would you have ever given it a second thought?" Mira didn't have an answer, and that was answer enough. Another beat of silence passed before Edric leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose as if the conversation had gone exactly how he expected it to. He turned to James Caldwell. "She's done here." Mira's blood went cold. Caldwell nodded, his expression unreadable. "Effective immediately, Mira Rowan's employment with the airline is terminated." Mira's hands shook violently under the table. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Isn't there?" "There's nothing else to say," Edric said simply. Mira's breath shuddered. Leora took a final sip of her tea before placing the cup down gently. "I suggest you take some time to think about what kind of person you've chosen to be," she said. And with that, she stood up. Edric followed, buttoning his suit jacket as he turned toward the door. The rest of the executives followed. Mira sat completely frozen, her mind spiraling, watching as the people who held her fate in their hands walked away without a second glance. She wasn't just fired, she was irrelevant. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving her alone. No job, no title, no control. For the first time in her life, Mira Rowan was nobody. Mira sat frozen in the empty boardroom, staring at the spot where Edric and Leora Whitmore had been sitting just moments ago. The silence in the room was suffocating. The echo of their final words rang in her head, each syllable heavier than the last. She was done. Fired. Not reprimanded. Not suspended. Fired. She had always believed she was untouchable. She had thought she knew the unspoken rules of first-class service, the way things worked, the silent hierarchy that had always existed. But today, she had been the one who was dismissed. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. This wasn't supposed to happen. All she had done was follow the same patterns, the same quiet choices she had made for years. She hadn't thought twice when she refused Edric and Leora water. She hadn't felt like she was doing anything wrong. But now she could see it. Now she could hear the deafening silence that had followed her decision. She had ignored the way passengers had started watching her differently. She had brushed off Sienna's hesitation, the way her colleague had tried to warn her. She had refused to acknowledge what was right in front of her, and now she was paying the price. Her heart pounded as the full magnitude of what had just happened hit her. It wasn't just that she had lost her job. It was that her name, her face, would now be tied to something much bigger than her. She could already imagine it. Passengers would talk, word would spread. A first-class flight attendant fired after mistreating the airline's owners. But that wouldn't be the real story. The real story would be about how she got there. How many people had she treated differently over the years? How many passengers had sat in those seats, felt the weight of her silent judgment, and said nothing? How many times had she dismissed someone convinced they weren't important enough to matter? Her stomach twisted, because for the first time she realized this had never been about Edric and Leora Whitmore. This was about everyone else, all the passengers before them, all the quiet injustices, all the choices she had made without a second thought. And now she was nothing more than a reminder, a name attached to a case that would be used in training programs, in corporate meetings, in discussions about bias in the airline industry. She was no longer Mira Rowan, senior flight attendant. She was Mira Rowan, the lesson. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. The door swung open, and one of the security officers stepped in. His face was unreadable, professional. "Ms. Rowan," he said, "we need to escort you out now." Her mouth felt dry. She nodded slowly, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped forward, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. The walk through the private corridors of the airport was agonizingly long. The security officer didn't speak, neither did she. When they reached the crew exit, Mira hesitated for half a second before stepping outside. The bright airport lights felt harsh against her skin. The airport staff walking by didn't even glance in her direction. She had been a presence before, someone passengers relied on, someone crew members looked to for direction. Now, she was just another face in the crowd. No uniform, no authority, no job. Just Mira Rowan, another person walking out of an airport. She turned her head slightly, her eyes landing on a large digital display board near the terminal entrance. A new announcement had just been posted. Whitmore Airlines implements new first-class service policy, stricter bias training for all cabin crew effective immediately. Mira's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she stared at the words, the reality of them sinking in. It was done. Her actions weren't just noticed. They had changed the airline. A policy rewrite, a shift in how things would be handled from now on, and her name would never be forgotten. She took a slow, shaky step forward. But there was no destination for her now. No uniform to return to. No flight schedule. No next assignment. She had spent her entire career believing she was the one with control. Now, she was just another person watching the world move on without her. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Not anymore. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means a lot.